Hello my friends, and welcome back to another video. Today I will show you how I took this thrift store find and transformed it into some beautiful autumn decor. It is Create Day, my friends, so let's get started. I picked up this sign at my local thrift store. I'm going to remove the stickers and sand off some of that font on the front so that I'm not working with a shiny surface. Get it all cleaned up, and then apply a coat of my white gesso to prime the surface for the rest of my paint. I'm using DIY's layered chocolate to paint the frame. You can check out my description box to find a full list of the products used in today's video, along with affiliate links. For the base coat on the inside of this sign, I'm using Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Chateau. Now I have these three colors of little craft paints: yellow ochre, burnt orange, and Spanish olive. I'm going to start using these to create my background. I will be using water with these, as well as a sea sponge. And I also have a nice soft lint-free rag on hand and a baby wipe just in case. So you can see I spritzed a little water on the board itself there to get this started. I'm starting with the yellow ochre. I'm going to spread this around across just a top section of the board, and then I will go in and blend in the burnt orange with that. I'm blotting off any excess so that I don't get total coverage. So I will keep watering down these paints as needed to blend them onto my board. And so as you can see, I blot up with the towel, and then I take that sea sponge and go over it with that to kind of pick up some more of that color and give it more of a texture pattern. I just keep repeating the same process, and when I get to the green, I add it in more sparingly. I did not want it over the entire board. That's what I'm doing here. So with that done, I'm taking my Fusion paint in the color Chateau, the original color that I used as the base coat. I've got this really watered down, and as I'm brushing it on, I'm adding even more water. I want this to just barely tone down all those colors, but not completely cover them. So I'm using the same techniques, brushing this down, watered on, wiping it back a little bit with that cloth, and then using my sponge to go in and create some little texture marks. The reason I did this is because I don't want that background being so bright and vibrant that it fights with my main focal points. I wanted it to be more muted. But that's just my personal taste for this project. You can do this however you'd like. And here I'm just painting the outer edge of that frame with the same layered chocolate paint. Now I'm going to take my burnt umber and mix just a little bit with my Chateau and sponge some of this on over that board. I needed just a little more coverage. I know it doesn't look like it in the point of view that you're getting, but in person it was still a little bit strong to me. So I sponged this mixture on, and it was kind of still too white. Added a little bit more of that, sponged that on until I got it to how I wanted it to look. Then I took a small brush and took my time and painted the inside of that frame. For the next layer on my background, I'm using IOD's Fruitful Harvest stamps. I'm just going to be using some of the leaves for this one, and I'm doing archival ink in peat moss and Pebble Beach. I want these to be very faint, so I'm inking them up and then putting them on a piece of paper first before I stamp them onto my background. Now, before I go any further, I want to get the back of this little frame painted up. I'm using that same DIY paint called Layered Chocolate. And initially, I wasn't going to paint the entire back. I was just going to do the frame. But you'll see that I end up changing that and painting the entire back. Now I'm going to go in with some sandpaper and do a little bit of distressing, especially around these edges. A little bit on the front of the frame, but kind of hitting the edges a little bit more to give it a distressed look. With that done, I gave this a coat of my Clear matte varnish. So now I'm going to take some light buttermilk and barnwood, mix them together, and dry brush this onto my frame. I'm offloading most of the paint from my brush and just doing little light touches of this around the whole frame. Now I'm going to use IOD's mold Hello Pumpkin and Sunflowers to make some castings. I'm using my Das air dry clay for the pumpkins. I'm going to make both the larger one and the smaller one. I cornstarch my mold and then get this all nice and flat on the back with my scraper. And then I can just roll that out. And then I put a little bit of water on my mat so I can dip my finger in it and smooth around those edges. I'm using Titebond Quick and Thick to glue this casting down onto my board. For the smaller casting, I want to make this look like it's kind of up and back behind that larger pumpkin. So I lay it on there and then just use my X-Acto knife to trim off the excess that would overlap that larger pumpkin. I glue that one in place, gently pressing down, careful to not distort my casting, wipe up any excess glue, and then I move on to paint. These are getting a base coat of that same color layered chocolate from DIY. I prefer to paint my castings before they're dry. I find that I get less cracking and shrinkage if I do that. So I'm going to be very careful here going around these edges, seeing how close to the sun I can fly without making a mess onto my board. I'm using this really small brush to get in around all those little edges that I couldn't quite catch with my bigger brush. Just still trying to keep this as neat as possible with getting the coverage that I need. Now I'm going to take some of that burnt orange acrylic craft paint, mix in a little bit of water, and start painting my pumpkins. The reason I'm watering it down is because I don't want full coverage over that brown. I still want some of that to show through. And yes, I did not seal my paint, the DIY paint, but that's okay because we're adding all these colors and then everything will get sealed afterwards. So now I'm going in with my second color of orange. It's called Terracotta. I'm going to brush this on a little more sparingly, just adding yet another layer of color. And then when that is done, I'm going in with my third orange, which is called Pumpkin, and adding that. So now I need to make my sunflower mold. I'm using the amazing casting resin for this. This is not going to be flat on the board. It's going to be suspended from a corner of the frame. So I did not want to use clay. And I could have used resin for the pumpkins as well, but I only had enough resin to do this sunflower, and then I tried to get a leaf out of it. But you can see, like, I missed a couple of spots here. So I'm going to fill those in with hot glue. This worked really well. In fact, you can use hot glue to make an entire casting if you want to. I just haven't quite perfected that technique. So I was happy that it worked out for me to just fill in these two little spots that needed to be filled in. And then this leaf, I ran out of resin, so I went ahead and filled that in as well. And DIY's layered chocolate again. This paint is getting a total workout today. I'm using this as the base coat on my sunflower. Now back to our pumpkins. I need to add some yellow ochre. I want lots of color variation and interest, so I've got that watered down and I'm brushing that on just like I did the oranges. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to start painting my leaf castings that I made. I didn't show that on camera, but I just made a bunch of the leaves from the sunflower mold using the one is the resin, and then I made some out of my DAS air dry clay. Now I'm using that same Spanish olive to paint over the raised leaf areas on the pumpkins. Now I'm going to mix together leaf green and forest moss to create a kind of a brighter green to add to my leaves on the pumpkins. I'm watering this down just so that it's more transparent and I don't get total coverage. And then I can come in with a little baby wipe and dab up any excess so that I still get all those colors showing through. I'm doing the same thing with the leaf castings that I made. I'm using that same mixture of leaf green and forest moss to go over them, wiping back any excess as needed. Now back to the sunflower. I'm using my black acrylic paint and my burnt umber. I'm starting off with the black in the very center, and then I will come in with the burnt umber and start blending that into the black so it graduates out to the outer section of that center with a lighter shade than in the very center of the sunflower. I'm going to apply some Dixie Belle Van Dyke brown glaze to my pumpkins, brushing this on and then wiping it back with one of those lint-free cloths that I have. The only thing that I wish I had done a little differently is I waited too long. I covered too much of this before I wiped it back, so it did end up being a little darker than I had wanted. But you know, in the end, it was okay. I just wish I had wiped it back a little sooner so it wasn't quite so dark. I'm using yellow ochre as my first yellow color on my sunflower, watering that down so that once again I get a little bit of transparency here, and some of that brown will still show through. I'm using burnt orange to go around that outer rim of the center, and then feathering it just ever so slightly into the yellow petals. I go back in with a little bit more of that yellow ochre to help make that little transition with the burnt orange more seamless. Now I'm using a medium shade of brown. I believe it's called bark brown. And I'm going around that outer edge of the center to lighten that up a little bit more. And then just kind of blend it into the center section of the sunflower. Now I'm using antique gold, watered down, to blend in on top of the yellow ochre. Again, just adding another layer of color and making sure that it's transparent enough that I don't completely cover up the other colors. Then I'm going to take my rag and dab off any excess. When that was dry, I'm taking a little more of that antique gold, and this time I'm dry brushing it just onto the outer tips of the petals. I'm wiping off most of the paint off my brush and just going over just to kind of lighten up those outer tips a little bit. Now I'm taking golden straw, which is lighter than the antique gold, and I'm going to dry brush over those tips with that as well to lighten them up a little bit more. Sorry for all these steps, but this is what I do just to make it look like the way I want it to. Now I'm taking that Dixie Belle Van Dyke Brown Glaze and applying that onto my sunflower. I work in smaller sections, wiping it back much sooner than I did on the pumpkins, so I had more control over how dark it was. And this time I'm using a baby wipe so I can wipe more of that off. And I was much happier with the result of this. This turned out better than my pumpkins did. So now to add some shadow around my pumpkins, I'm using Dixie Belle's Dixie Dirt. You apply a coat of Mod Podge so it has something to stick to. And I thought I was getting this, nice and skinny around the pumpkins, but in the end, I just kind of ended up with a big mess. This would have been much easier to just take some brown paint, go around the edges of the pumpkins, and then feather it out. But I wanted texture, so that's why I did this. So I had the Mod Podge on there, and now I'm adding all that Dixie Dirt. I'm going to set this aside and let it dry, and then we'll come in and shake off all that extra Dixie Dirt, putting it onto some aluminum foil so that I can pour it all back into the container when I'm done. I'm using a stiff brush to help loosen up any of that. And I knew it was going to be too much of a gray color. And here I'm just wiping off all the excess off of my pumpkins with a baby wipe. So I had planned on painting it. I decided to take, instead of straight black, mix in some brown. I thought that would be like a nice dark shadow, but it ended up being way too dark. It looked like I just had this black line around my pumpkins. So now I got to fix it. I'm going to grab some of my lighter colors and go in and just start painting along that, kind of feathering that out, and work with this until I'm happy with it. I'm mixing the yellow ochre in with some of that Fusion Chateau, because you remember that was the original base color, and I had all those layers of colors on top of that, or underneath it actually, that it looked too white around that shadow. So I had to try and blend that in to make it look more natural, as if it was still a part of that background. So here's how it turned out after all that fiddling that I could have avoided. Not ideal, but lesson learned. Now it's time to seal our leaves and the sunflower and the pumpkins with my Clear matte varnish. Originally, I had planned to just put my leaf castings down on the bottom section, but when I laid them out, I wasn't happy with how it looked, so I decided to fill in that bottom with some moss, just applying it with hot glue. I started out with the green moss, and then I went back over that with a little bit of the Spanish moss. Now it's time to glue down those castings. I'm using hot glue for the leaves, and then I will be using the Type Bond Quick and Thick for the sunflower. Now, as a support for the sunflower, since it hangs over the opening, I made this little block out of pieces of thin scrap wood, painted it brown, and then I'm just gluing that down so that it gives something for that sunflower to grab onto, so it's not just hanging there with no support. I added just a little bit more Spanish moss over this one leaf, and I used my Quick and Thick for that. I felt like it just needed a little something there to make it look more complete. Before I do the final steps on the front, because we are almost done, yay! I decided that this back, it had like a spot where I couldn't get it clean, and it was bugging me. So I took that layered chocolate, painted the entire back, and then sealed it with that Clear matte varnish. I'm taking my jute twine. I'm going to wrap this around about 4 times and then tie it off on the left-hand side. This is a strip of that homespun fabric that I get from Amazon. I'm just going to cut a very skinny little piece, just long enough so that I can tie a little simple bow out of it. I'm going to use my IOD Apothecary label stamps to create a little banner. It's out of just a piece of packing paper, and I line up my letters to say Harvest. I'm using Stays On ink and Temper Brown. Just going to stamp that up and then stamp it onto this piece of packing paper. Then I can cut that out in the shape I want, and then I'm going to crumple it up and get it nice and aged looking. And then I will use my little sponge applicator to apply the Distress Oxide Vintage Photo over the entire thing. This is a little wooden crow that I got from 24 Hour Crafts. I painted it black, sanded it down a little bit to distress it, and then covered it with antiquing wax. And I'm using my hot glue to apply his tail and his head to the top of the frame. And then I will attach his feet to the string with some Fabri-Tac glue. I'm going to use a little drop of hot glue to attach that bow that I made, and then I'm using a little bit of the Fabri-Tac glue to attach the harvest banner. I'm going to take one of these little sunflowers that I got from Hobby Lobby and distress this up a little bit with that vintage photo, and then apply that on top of the bow. The last thing I did to this was make a hang tag, and I used the Amazon cardstock tags, added some decoupage on them, some jute twine, a little sunflower, and that made this project totally complete. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate each and every one of you, and I hope you find my content useful. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, but more importantly, I hope I've inspired you to go create something. See you next time.